Okay, so I want to finish off what's been on in the America. There's basically three big empires in the Americas during this time period: the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca. Um, and there's a tendency, I think, for people to kind of blend them all together, which is a little, which we should try not to do because they have their own distinct things going on, even though they have a lot in common. Like for instance, they all have the sort of similar sort of mythology, and they all have an interest in this kind of ball game that's played. Some of them have a connection to human sacrifice. So there are some similarities, but they're their own distinct cultures, and I think we should think about that. I think maybe it's more useful to think about what cultures are they connected to. So the Olmecs, who were in the Gulf of Mexico, they are connected to the Aztecs, and also connected to the Maya, whereas the Norte Chico civilization back in Peru, back in the Andes, is connected to the Inca civilization very strongly. And again, there's less information about them than we'd like because a lot of the records were wiped out by Europeans. But to be fair, some of the records were saved by Europeans as well. So we actually do know probably more about these civilizations than, say, the Olmecs and the Norte Chico civilization. Okay, so let's start with the Aztec Empire, also known as the Mexica civilization. This is where we get the name Mexico, Mexican, Mexico City, and the Aztecs. This was their holy land, the sort of region of the Gulf of Mexico, particularly Tenochtitlan, which is where Mexico City is today. And this was again a pretty big empire, kind of comparable maybe to like the Assyrian Empire or the Babylonian Empire in terms of size, but also pretty powerful and ruling over a lot of different people. One of the major achievements of the Aztec Empire was their skill at irrigation. So they were able to move a lot of water around to water their crops, which in a region as dry as the Gulf of Mexico is a pretty useful and powerful thing to allow them to do a lot of farming, grow a lot of crops. And the way they had it set up was that the nobles in the society, the big power that they had was to be in charge of getting this water from place to place, be in charge of these canals. It was sort of a responsibility as well. And when the Spanish came and encountered the Aztecs, they were pretty intimidated by the Aztecs. They were like, I don't know if we can defeat these guys. They're pretty powerful. And the truth with a lot of these empires is that a big part of the reason that they were brought down by outsiders, particularly the Spanish in the case of all of these empires, is that there was disease. Europeans were living in sort of bigger, tighter cities, and so they had a lot more immunity to disease and different diseases than the Aztecs and the Maya and Inca. Um, the Spanish did pick up some diseases, but not as many and not as devastating as the diseases. So, when a whole large part of the population dies off, that does tend to make you more vulnerable to outside invasion. And of course, there's also the factor of gunpowder and things like that. But the Aztec culture, yeah, the Aztec culture is descended from the Olmecs, who were also in this region as well. And they referred to the Olmecs as the rubber people. But I want the city of Tenochtitlan because it's pretty impressive. Look at what's going on here. We've got basically the city in the middle of this lake. So they've taken the islands in this lake and connected them with all these pathways and also sort of canals running through the city so that it can grow stuff. This is the Holy Land according to Aztec religion, and this is basically where Mexico City is today. You can hardly see any of this now because it's been so built over, but the lake here was used to basically give water for growing agriculture in such a dry region. And the pathways, they'd have canals for the boats to go through, and they'd have paths for people to walk through. So everything was very well connected. And another thing they did was chinampas, which are artificial islands. So they would build additional islands in the shallow parts of the lake bed to have more space for growing stuff. So that's pretty cool. And these are the people, or some of the people who domesticated corn, which they called maize. Um, and so that became like a food stuff that they could rely on. In fact, they took it and developed it by breeding to the point where corn doesn't, reproduce. The plant doesn't reproduce without human help. So that's pretty cool. So it shows that there were many generations of breeding, and that their agricultural success was quite substantial. Here is a sort of map of the sort of layout of the central city and of the larger central island, and you can kind of get a sense of the kind of stuff that they were doing there. It's pretty darn cool. Okay, so that's the main stuff we have to say for the Aztecs, I believe. You mentioned the human sacrifice. We kind of talked about this earlier with the Olmecs, their predecessors. But the thing to remember about human sacrifice is it usually seems to have been practiced on enemies. So you'd go to war, you'd bring back a bunch of captives, and you'd sacrifice those guys. And think about what kind of power that shows. It shows, A, don't mess with the king, and B, that the king is very powerful and defeating your enemies for you. So that seems to be the goal of human sacrifice and the connection to religion. It wasn't necessarily sacrificing your own people, although, you can debate over who your enemies are there. Okay, so now let's move on to talking about the Inca. So the Inca is in quite a different part of the Americas. The Inca Empire is running along basically the same region as the Norte Chico civilization, only it's much bigger. It's going through basically all of the Andes Mountains, and look at how far it extends. At a certain point, this was the largest empire on Earth, and, a record setter for human history. And a lot of our evidence comes out for relatively late, comes along really in the 1400s, but there were predecessors before that. Basically, the Inca Empire is like a super group of other empires that were already in the region. So its name means Empire of the Four Regions. So the four regions became one unified alliance and, super empire, kind of like the Roman Empire, around the time of the Europeans, the Spanish, coming over. And it seems like they drew a lot on all of these kingdoms drew a lot on the Norte Chico culture. For instance, they still used quipus instead of writing, those sort of systems of knotted rope. This fellow known as Pachacuti seems to have united all these empires and been around even at the time when Europeans first started coming over and interacting with them. And again, they were destroyed by the Spanish, with help from the fact that maybe these kingdoms weren't as unified as they thought, because they had fallen into kind of a civil war around the time the Spanish arrived. But again, the Spanish were pretty impressed, and they had to do a lot of sort of deal making with the people in the Civil War in order to get their own sort of foot in the door there. Another thing about the Inca Empire is that they were very sort of government run for everything. They almost feel today like they might be kind of socialist or even communistic in the sense that the government decides who does what jobs and when. For instance, they had this whole thing of they didn't really use money. They had sort of a system of obligations. So you are in debt because that guy helped you out. This guy built this, and so now you owe him, so you got to go build something for him, something like that. And everybody owes a certain amount of work to the government, so they tax you to do a certain amount of work, running the farms, building stuff like that. So that's kind of wild and interesting, and a very interesting subject to go into. One of their big famous cities is Machu Picchu, which is an outpost of theirs, which shows off the kind of things they were doing with agriculture, those terraces in the mountains, in the Andes Mountains, and just these spectacular temples. So it's a really beautiful place to go visit if you ever get the chance. And that is the Inca Empire. And again, they're doing that terrace farming, which is pretty cool. And Uchi is also known as Cusco, which is pretty wild that in a certain sense he's represented in the Disney movie of The Emperor's New Groove. But That's pretty far away from the actual Inca emperor. But yeah, eventually Pachacuti was defeated, and the Spanish were able to take over the region. Is sensing a pattern here. Their architecture is kind of wild and interesting. They have what's known as 12 angle stone, which means basically they just find whatever stones and then they cut them into whatever shape they think would work best. So it's not super, it's not super regular like say Greek stone. It's more of a hodgepodge, but they make it look really good. And they make sure that it's all very tight and very strong. They just don't care about making everything perfectly square. So that's kind of interesting. And Inca religion, we actually know a fair bit about because of Spanish folks who wrote that down. Maybe not 100% accurate, but we got a good bit of it. And we see, for instance, some things that descend from the Norte Chico civilization, like their god Viracocha, who is kind of the creator god, and carries these staffs, is very similar to the staff god who appears in Norte Chico culture. So that's pretty cool. Probably descended from that god. Okay, and the Maya, more accurate to say the Maya than the Mayans. The Maya were more in that sort of region near the Aztecs. And like the Aztecs, they were descended from the Olmecs. The Maya are known for their astronomy. You might have heard about the Mayan calendar for various reasons. They were very good at keeping track of the stars and keeping track of sort of cycles of time. But they didn't necessarily have any dire prophecies or anything like that. It's more that they just wanted to keep track of all the sort of units of time that they could. So they were thinking about their calendar for thousands of years out. So that's pretty cool. And they could do that because they had such a good view of astronomy. One of the interesting things about the Maya is that they go into a real decline around the 900s. So they are maybe even older than the Aztecs. But at a certain point, they sort of disappear off the map, and then they come back again. But in the 900s, they sort of disappear from the cities for some reason, for reasons we don't understand. And a lot of archaeologists are curious about that and trying to figure it out what it was. Maybe there was a drought, and they suffered a decline. They had to kind of rebuild. But by the time the Spanish arrive, they are very wealthy. They're mostly living on the coast. Again, we have some good documents of their mythology. And we know they had a myth of these sort of hero twins, which is actually a similar myth that we see in North American, Native American cultures like the Pueblo and whatnot. So there may have been some connections there, which is pretty cool. And then the way to tell if you're looking at Mayan art, the art of the Maya, is look for something that looks kind of feathery and fluffy, because the Maya seem to really love these sort of feathery patterns in all their art. These headdresses sort of taken from feathers and associated with gods like the feathered serpent god. So if the Aztecs are up here, the Maya are over here, if that makes sense. And they seem to have been more over here during the earlier period, and then they'd move to the coast, or further north in their later period. And the major sites of the Maya is Chichen Itza, where they have stepped pyramids. And step pyramids are pretty popular with all these cultures. That's another similarity there. But the ones at Chichen Itza are some of the most spectacular today and have that very distinctive style. And again, they like these sort of they like these feathery art styles and feathered headdresses and things like that. And they have this way of doing carvings that's kind of flat, as you see here, these relief carvings. They also have this sort of kind of language that we haven't really figured out. I mean, it's definitely a language. It's a writing style that's very unique and stands out. These sort of squarish glyphs, almost like hieroglyphics. And we haven't entirely figured them out yet, but we have a sense of how they use them for numeric systems and whatnot. But there's still a lot more that we want to investigate there. But yeah, that's the Maya culture. So, if you can, try and keep apart the different things that are unique to each culture. Like the Olmecs have their stone heads, the Maya have their feathers and their glyphs. And again, they have the hero twins who go to the underworld and win a ball game against the Lords of the Dead. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Next time will be review, and I will see you in the comments today.